The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. Maya rolled over and hit the snooze button with more force than necessary. Her small apartment felt even smaller in the gray morning light filtering through the thin curtains. The walls were bare except for a single framed photo of her grandmother, sitting at an old upright piano, fingers dancing across the keys with pure joy on her weathered face. Maya dragged herself out of bed and stumbled to the tiny kitchenette. The coffee maker gurgled to life as she stared at her reflection in the microwave door. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of another late night studying music theory textbooks after her shift at the Ivory Room. At 28, she felt decades older than her years. The Ivory Room wasn't just any restaurant. It sat in the heart of downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling business district. The kind of place where a single meal cost more than Maya made in tips during a good week. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and every table was dressed with crisp white linens and real silver cutlery. But what really made the place special was the magnificent grand piano that sat in the corner of the main dining room. That piano haunted Maya's dreams. It was a beautiful black Steinway, polished to perfection with ivory keys that practically glowed under the soft lighting. Every day she walked past it dozens of times, carrying plates and refilling water glasses, and every time she felt a familiar ache in her chest. The piano remained silent most days, like a sleeping giant waiting for the right person to wake it up. Maya had been playing piano since she was 6 years old. Her grandmother had taught her on that old upright in the photo, the one with 3 broken keys and a bench that wobbled if you moved too much. But Maya had loved it anyway. She'd spent countless hours practicing scales and simple melodies while her grandmother clapped and sang along. Music wasn't just something she did, it was part of who she was, like breathing or thinking. After her grandmother passed away when Maya was 18, everything changed. The family couldn't keep the old piano, and Maya found herself working 2 jobs just to pay for community college. Music became something she did in her spare time, which seemed to get smaller and smaller each year. She'd play on the digital keyboard in her apartment, but it wasn't the same. The keys felt plastic and lifeless compared to the real thing. Working at the Ivory Room was supposed to be temporary. Maya had taken the job 3 years ago when she needed quick money to pay for music theory classes at the community college downtown. She figured she'd work there for a few months, save up some cash, and then find something better. Something that would let her focus on music instead of carrying heavy trays and dealing with demanding customers. But life had other plans. The job paid better than most server positions in the city, and the tips were decent when she worked the evening shift. The money she'd planned to save for music school kept getting eaten up by rent, car repairs, and all the other expenses that seemed to multiply like rabbits. Her dream of attending the prestigious music conservatory across town felt more impossible with each passing month. The customers at the Ivory Room were a different breed entirely. They wore expensive suits and designer dresses, talked about stock portfolios and vacation homes, and treated the waitstaff like they were invisible. Maya had learned to smile politely while they snapped their fingers at her, or complained about their food being 2 degrees too cold. She'd perfected the art of being present but unnoticed, efficient but forgettable. Some nights, when the restaurant was closed and Maya was helping with closing duties, she'd find excuses to walk past the piano. She'd pretend to wipe down nearby tables while stealing glances at the keys, imagining what it would feel like to sit on that bench and let her fingers find their way across the smooth ivory. She knew every inch of that instrument by heart, from the subtle scratches on the music stand to the way the light reflected off its polished surface. The piano wasn't just furniture to Maya, it represented everything she'd given up. Every dream she'd put on hold. On her worst days, looking at it made her feel like a failure. On her better days, it reminded her of why she was working so hard, why she dragged herself to those night classes even when her feet ached from a 12-hour shift. Maya's co-workers thought she was a little strange. While they spent their break time scrolling through social media or gossiping about customers, Maya would sit in the staff room with music theory books spread across the table. She'd study chord progressions and sight-reading exercises, trying to keep her musical skills sharp even though she rarely had time to practice anymore. The other servers were nice enough, but they didn't understand her obsession with music. They had their own dreams and struggles, their own reasons for working at the Ivory Room. Some were actors waiting for their big break, others were students working their way through college. But none of them looked at that piano the way Maya did, with a mixture of longing and heartbreak that she tried to keep hidden behind her professional smile. Every few weeks, the Ivory Room would hire a pianist for special events. Maya would watch from behind the service counter as elegant men and women in formal attire sat at her piano and filled the dining room with beautiful music. The customers would pause their conversations to listen, wine glasses suspended halfway to their lips, genuinely moved by the performances. During those evenings, Maya felt like she was watching her alternate life unfold. She could picture herself in a flowing black dress sitting at that bench, her fingers bringing the piano to life while the room fell silent in appreciation. But then someone would call her name, asking for more bread or another bottle of wine, and the fantasy would dissolve like morning mist. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion or the demanding customers. It was the slow, crushing realization that she was letting her talent slip away. Each day that passed without serious practice was a day she fell further behind the musicians who were actively pursuing their careers. She could feel her technique getting rusty, her musical instincts growing dull from lack of use. But Maya refused to give up completely. 3 nights a week after her shifts ended, she'd drive across town to the community college for music theory classes. The other students were mostly younger, fresh out of high school and full of ambition. Maya felt ancient compared to them, but she kept going. Knowledge was something nobody could take away from her, and she held on to every lesson like a lifeline. Her instructor, Mr. Chen, had noticed her dedication. He'd pulled her aside after class one evening and asked about her background. When Maya told him about her grandmother and her years of informal training, his eyes had lit up with interest. He'd encouraged her to audition for the music program at the state university, but Maya just smiled sadly. The tuition alone would take her years to save, and that was assuming she could find the time to complete all the prerequisite courses. So Maya continued her double life, smiling and serving by day, studying and dreaming by night. She told herself that someday things would change. Someday she'd find a way to make music her career instead of her hobby. But with each passing month, that someday seemed to drift further away, like a star slowly disappearing behind clouds. Friday evening at the Ivory Room was always chaos, but this particular Friday felt different from the moment Maya walked through the employee entrance. The kitchen staff was buzzing with nervous energy, and she could hear Mr. Peterson, the general manager, talking rapidly on his phone in the office. His voice carried that particular edge that meant something had gone very wrong. Maya tied her apron and checked her appearance in the small mirror by the staff lockers. The dining room was already filling up with guests, but these weren't the usual mix of business dinners and anniversary celebrations. Tonight was different. Tonight was the annual charity gala for the Children's Hospital Foundation, an event that brought together the city's most influential people under one roof. The guest list read like a who's who of local power brokers, city council members, successful entrepreneurs, judges, and society wives who organized fundraising events like military campaigns. Maya had worked similar events before, and she knew the drill. These guests expected perfection in everything, from the temperature of their wine to the timing of their courses. One small mistake could result in complaints that reached management within minutes. As Maya straightened the last of the silverware on her assigned tables, she noticed something unusual. The beautiful grand piano had been moved slightly, positioned so it was more prominently featured in the room. A small spotlight had been added above it, creating a warm pool of light that made the polished black surface gleam like a mirror. Sheet music was already arranged on the music stand, suggesting that live entertainment was planned for the evening. Maya felt that familiar pang in her chest as she looked at the piano. She'd heard through the staff grapevine that management had hired a professional pianist for tonight's event, someone with credentials impressive enough to perform for this particular crowd. The thought of watching another musician play her dream instrument made her stomach tighten, but she pushed the feeling down. Tonight wasn't about her dreams. Tonight was about doing her job perfectly and earning the substantial tips that events like these usually generated. The first hour went smoothly. Maya moved efficiently between her tables, taking drink orders and explaining the evening's special menu. The guests were dressed to the nines, the women in elegant gowns and sparkling jewelry, the men in perfectly tailored tuxedos. Conversations centered around stock market trends, upcoming political elections, and vacation plans to exotic locations. Maya smiled and nodded at the appropriate moments, invisible but essential, just as she'd trained herself to be. She was refilling water glasses at table 12 when she first heard Mr. Peterson's voice rising above the gentle din of conversation. He was standing near the kitchen entrance, still clutching his phone, and his face had gone pale. Maya couldn't make out the exact words, but his body language screamed disaster. She caught the attention of Lisa, another server who'd been working at the Ivory Room for 5 years. "What's going on?" Maya whispered as they crossed paths near the wine station. Lisa shook her head, looking worried. "Something about the pianist. I think there's a problem." Maya's stomach dropped. She glanced toward the piano, still bathed in that perfect spotlight, waiting for someone to bring it to life. The sheet music sat untouched, and she could see Mr. Peterson making increasingly frantic phone calls. This wasn't good. Events like tonight's were planned months in advance, and every detail was supposed to be locked down weeks ago. 20 minutes later, the situation became clearer. Maya overheard Mr. Peterson explaining the crisis to Mrs. Wellington, the event coordinator from the hospital foundation. The hired pianist, a well-respected classical musician from the symphony, had been in a car accident that afternoon. Nothing serious, thank goodness, but enough to leave him with a sprained wrist that made performing impossible. He'd called just an hour ago, full of apologies but unable to fulfill his commitment. Mrs. Wellington's carefully composed expression cracked slightly. Maya could see the panic beneath the polite smile. This wasn't just background music they were talking about. The live piano performance was supposed to be a highlight of the evening, something special to accompany the auction portion of the fundraiser. These donors had paid premium prices for their tables, and they expected an evening that justified the expense. "We'll figure something out," Mr. Peterson assured her, though Maya could hear the doubt in his voice. "I'm calling every music agency in the city," but Maya knew it was probably hopeless. Professional pianists who could perform for this caliber of audience weren't sitting around waiting for last-minute calls on Friday evening. They were either already booked at other events or had made weekend plans that couldn't be changed on 2 hours' notice. As the minutes ticked by, Maya watched Mr. Peterson grow more desperate. His phone calls became increasingly animated, and she could see him making offers that probably exceeded the evening's entertainment budget. But each call ended the same way, with him hanging up and immediately dialing another number. The guests were starting to notice something was wrong. The piano sat silent and conspicuous, and Maya overheard several conversations wondering when the music would begin. Mrs. Wellington did her best to keep spirits high, moving from table to table with bright conversation, but Maya could see the stress lines forming around her eyes. During a brief lull between courses, Maya found herself standing near the piano again. Her hand almost reached out to touch the keys before she caught herself. This close, she could see her reflection in the polished surface, distorted and dreamlike. The sheet music on the stand was a collection of classical pieces and jazz standards, exactly the kind of repertoire she'd been studying in her theory classes and practicing on her digital keyboard at home. She knew these pieces. Not just knew them, but really knew them. She'd worked through the Bach prelude sitting on top of the stack, spending weeks perfecting the fingering and timing. The Chopin Nocturne underneath was one of her favorites, a piece she'd first learned from her grandmother and had been refining ever since. Even the more contemporary jazz arrangements were familiar. She'd bought the same collection of sheet music months ago and had been working through it systematically. Maya glanced around the dining room. Mr. Peterson was still on the phone, pacing near the kitchen entrance with the determined expression of a man running out of options. The guests were getting restless, checking their watches and glancing toward the silent piano with increasing frequency. In 30 minutes, the auction portion of the evening was supposed to begin, and it would feel awkward and incomplete without the musical accompaniment that had been promised. Her heart started beating faster as a crazy idea began forming in her mind. She tried to push it away, telling herself she was being ridiculous, but the thought kept returning, growing stronger with each passing moment. She could play these pieces, maybe not with the polished perfection of a conservatory graduate, but well enough to fill the silence that was growing more uncomfortable by the minute. But who was she kidding? She was a waitress, not a performer. These guests expected professional entertainment, not some amateur hour performance from the help. The very idea was presumptuous. maybe even insulting to people who'd paid good money for a sophisticated evening out. Yet as Maya looked around the room, she could see the evening slowly deflating. The energy that had been building toward the auction was dissipating into disappointment and awkward silence. Mrs. Wellington was doing her best to maintain momentum, but even her considerable social skills couldn't entirely compensate for the missing musical centerpiece. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she set down the water pitcher she'd been holding. 3 years of walking past that piano, 3 years of dreaming about what it would feel like to sit on that bench and let her fingers find their way across those keys. 3 years of watching other musicians play the instrument that haunted her dreams. She looked toward Mr. Peterson, still frantically working his phone. His usually perfect appearance was showing cracks. His tie was loosened and sweat beaded on his forehead. Despite the restaurant's perfect climate control, this was his reputation on the line too, and Maya could see the desperation growing with each failed phone call. Taking a deep breath that felt like it contained all the courage she'd been saving up for 28 years, Maya made a decision that would change everything. She walked toward Mr. Peterson, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone in the restaurant could hear it. "Excuse me, Mr. Peterson," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from his phone, distracted and clearly frustrated. "Not now, Maya, we have a situation here." "I know," she said, swallowing hard. "I can help." He stared at her blankly, not understanding. "I can play," she said, the words coming out in a rush before she lost her nerve. "The piano. I can play the piano," the words hung in, the air between them like a challenge neither quite believed. Mr. Peterson stared at Maya with the expression of a drowning man who'd just been thrown what might be either a life preserver or an anchor. His phone was still pressed to his ear, but Maya could hear the automated message telling him the number he'd dialed was no longer in service. "You can what?" he asked, lowering the phone slowly. Maya's mouth had gone completely dry, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "I can play piano. I've been playing since I was little, and I know those pieces." She gestured toward the sheet music on the piano, her hand shaking slightly. "I know I'm just a server, but I could fill in until you find someone else." Mr. Peterson glanced toward the piano, then back at Maya, then toward Mrs. Wellington, who was approaching their conversation with the determined stride of someone who'd overheard just enough to be dangerous. The evening was supposed to transition into its main entertainment phase in less than 20 minutes, and the silence where music should have been was becoming more noticeable with each passing moment. "You play piano?" Mrs. Wellington asked, joining their huddle near the kitchen entrance. Her tone was carefully neutral, but Maya could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. "What kind of playing are we talking about? Chopsticks? Happy birthday?" Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she stood her ground. "Classical training. Jazz standards. I've been taking theory classes at the community college and I practice regularly." She paused, knowing how inadequate that sounded compared to the professional credentials they'd been expecting. "I know it's not the same as hiring a real pianist, but I could play background music during dinner and maybe something for the auction." Mr. Peterson was already shaking his head. "Maya, I appreciate the offer, I really do, but these guests are expecting professional entertainment. This isn't a coffee shop open mic night. These are some of the most influential people in the city. And they're sitting in silence right now," Maya pointed out, surprising herself with her boldness. "At least if I play, there's music. If I mess up, you can always stop me and make an announcement about technical difficulties or something." Mrs. Wellington was studying Maya with new interest. "How long have you been playing?" 22 years, Maya answered honestly. "My grandmother taught me when I was 6. I've never stopped, even though I had to put it on the back burner for work." "Can you sight read?" Mrs. Wellington asked, nodding toward the sheet music. Maya's confidence grew slightly. "Yes, those pieces up there, I've actually played most of them before. The Bach Prelude, the Chopin Nocturne, several of the jazz standards. I have the same collection at home." Mr. Peterson looked like a man caught between two equally terrifying options. On one hand, letting an untested employee perform for the city's elite seemed like professional suicide. On the other hand, the alternative was explaining to 300 premium ticket holders why there would be no music at their charity gala. The decision was made for him when Judge Harrison, one of the evening's honorary hosts, approached their group. Maya recognized him from the newspaper's society pages. A distinguished man in his 70s who served on half a dozen nonprofit boards and had donated a new wing to the children's hospital. "Excuse me," Judge Harrison said politely, but I couldn't help wondering about the piano. Several of our guests have been asking when the music will begin. Mrs. Wellington and Mr. Peterson exchanged glances loaded with panic and resignation. Maya could practically see them weighing their limited options in real time. "We've had a last-minute change in our entertainment," Mrs. Wellington said carefully, "but we're working on a solution." Judge Harrison looked at Maya, who was still wearing her server's uniform and looked decidedly out of place in their urgent huddle. "Are you our solution?" he asked with a kind smile. Maya felt like every eye in the restaurant had suddenly focused on her, though logically she knew most of the guests were still engrossed in their conversations and wine. "I hope so, sir. I mean, I'd like to try. What would you play?" Judge Harrison asked. Maya glanced toward the piano, her mind racing through possibilities. "I was thinking I could start with something gentle during dinner. Maybe some Chopin, some light jazz, then for the auction, something with more energy to keep people engaged." Mr. Peterson jumped in, clearly trying to manage expectations. "Judge Harrison, please understand that Maya is one of our servers. She's offering to help in an emergency situation, but she's not the professional pianist we had planned." Judge Harrison studied Maya for a long moment. There was something in his expression that reminded her of her grandmother, a kind of patient wisdom that seemed to see past surface appearances. "Young lady, do you think you can play well enough to enhance this evening rather than distract from it?" It was a fair question, and Maya appreciated his directness. She thought about all those hours practicing on her grandmother's wobbly bench, all the theory classes she'd attended after exhausting work shifts, all the time she'd stood next to this very piano wondering what it would feel like to finally play it. "I think so," she said quietly. "I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I can promise I'll do my best to make it beautiful." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "That's all any of us can promise, isn't it?" He turned to Mrs. Wellington. "I think we should let her try." Mrs. Wellington looked at Mr. Peterson, who looked like he was calculating the cost of potential disaster against the certainty of disappointment. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. 10 minutes, he said to Maya. "Play for 10 minutes during the salad course. If it goes well, we'll talk about the auction portion." Maya felt her knees go weak with a combination of terror and excitement. "Thank you, both of you. I won't let you down." "Wait," Mrs. Wellington said suddenly. "You can't perform in your uniform." She looked Maya up and down, taking in the practical black slacks and white shirt that marked her as staff. "It will confuse the guests and undermine the whole presentation." Maya's heart sank. She'd been so focused on the musical challenge that she hadn't considered the visual aspect. She didn't own anything remotely appropriate for performing at this level of event, and there certainly wasn't time to go shopping. "I might have something," said a voice behind them. They turned to see Catherine, one of the evening's guests who had apparently overheard enough of their conversation to understand the situation. Maya recognized her as Mrs. Chen, the wife of a prominent attorney who'd been coming to the ivory room for years. "I have a change of clothes in my car," Mrs. Chen continued. "I came straight from another event, and I always pack a backup dress." "We look about the same size," she smiled at Maya encouragingly. "Every performer deserves the right costume." Maya felt overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness from someone who barely knew her. "That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't—" "Nonsense," Mrs. Chen interrupted. "I'll get it right now. Black dress, appropriate for the occasion. You go get yourself ready mentally and don't worry about the rest." As Mrs. Chen hurried toward the exit, Maya realized that her simple offer to help had somehow snowballed into something much bigger than she'd anticipated. In the span of 10 minutes, she'd gone from invisible waitress to emergency entertainment, and now she was about to wear a stranger's dress to perform for people she'd been serving dinner to just an hour earlier. Mr. Peterson was checking his watch nervously. "Maya, are you absolutely sure about this? Because once you sit down at that piano, there's no taking it back. Everyone will be watching." Maya looked across the dining room at the beautiful Steinway, still bathed in its perfect spotlight, still waiting for someone to bring it to life. She thought about her grandmother's weathered hands guiding her small fingers across those broken keys so many years ago. She thought about all the evenings she'd spent studying music theory, while her feet ached from 12-hour shifts. She thought about the dreams she'd been carrying like stones in her chest for 3 long years. "I'm sure," she said, and for the first time in months, she actually meant it. Mrs. Chen returned with a garment bag, pressing it into Maya's hands with a warm smile. "This should work perfectly. Good luck, dear. I have a feeling we're all about to witness something special." As Maya headed toward the staff restroom to change, she could hear Mr. Peterson making a brief announcement to the dining room about a special musical surprise. Her hands were shaking as she unzipped the garment bag, but underneath the nerves was something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It was hope, mixed with the kind of terrifying excitement that comes with stepping off a cliff and trusting that you'll find your wings on the way down. Maya stared at herself in the staff restroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back. Mrs. Chen's dress was a perfect fit, a classic black number with clean lines that transformed Maya from server to performer, with the simple act of changing clothes. The fabric felt expensive against her skin, and the cut was flattering in a way that made her stand taller, shoulders back with unconscious confidence. But it was her eyes that surprised her most. For 3 years she'd perfected the art of being invisible, of blending into the background while she served other people's dreams. Now looking at her reflection, she saw something different. Fear, yes, but also anticipation, the kind of electric energy that comes with finally stepping toward something you've been avoiding for too long. She took a deep breath and walked back into the dining room. The transformation was immediate and obvious. Conversations paused mid-sentence as guests noticed her, trying to reconcile the waitress who'd been refilling their water glasses with the elegant woman now moving purposefully toward the piano. Maya felt every eye in the room following her progress, but instead of the usual invisible scrutiny she was used to, this felt different. This felt like being seen. Mr. Peterson gave her an encouraging nod from his position near the kitchen, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. Mrs. Wellington had taken a seat at a nearby table where she could provide supportive applause if needed, or damage control if things went badly. Judge Harrison raised his wine glass slightly in her direction, a small gesture that felt like a blessing. The walk to the piano seemed to take forever, and no time at all. Maya's heels clicked against the polished floor with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. 20 steps, 15, 10. And then she was there, standing next to the instrument that had haunted her dreams for 3 years. Up close, the piano was even more magnificent than she'd imagined. The keys seemed to glow under the spotlight, and she could see her reflection multiplied in the polished black surface. The bench was the perfect height, and when she sat down, it felt like coming home after a very long journey. Maya placed her hands on the keys without pressing down, just feeling the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. The dining room had grown remarkably quiet, though she wasn't sure if that was because people were genuinely curious about what was about to happen, or because they were politely waiting for her to fail so they could return to their conversations. She chose to start with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that had been one of her grandmother's favorites. It was beautiful without being showy, elegant without demanding too much attention from the dinner conversation. Maya closed her eyes for just a moment, remembering her grandmother's voice. "Don't play the notes, dear. Play the feeling behind the notes." The first chord filled the room like a gentle breath, rich and warm and perfectly in tune. Maya felt a shock of pure joy as the sound washed over her. This was what she'd been missing, what her digital keyboard at home could never quite capture. The resonance, the way each note seemed to bloom and fade into the next, the subtle vibrations she could feel through the bench and into her bones. The melody unfolded naturally, as if it had been waiting inside the piano all along and just needed her fingers to set it free. Maya let herself sink into the music, trusting her years of training and practice to guide her hands while her mind focused on the emotional landscape of the piece. The nocturne was like a conversation between day and night, melancholy and hope, memory and possibility. Around her, the restaurant had transformed. Conversations had grown quieter, not stopping entirely but shifting to match the mood of the music. She could hear the soft clink of silverware against china, the gentle splash of wine being poured, but everything felt softer somehow, more intentional. The music wasn't dominating the space. It was enhancing it, creating a backdrop that made every other sound more meaningful. When the nocturne ended, there was a moment of perfect silence before gentle applause rippled through the room. Maya opened her eyes to find people looking at her with expressions she'd never seen before. Not the polite dismissal she was used to, but genuine interest and appreciation. Judge Harrison was smiling broadly, and Mrs. Wellington was nodding with what looked like relief and growing excitement. Encouraged, Maya transitioned into a jazz standard, "The Way You Look Tonight." She'd always loved the playful sophistication of jazz, the way it allowed for personal interpretation, while maintaining its essential structure. Her arrangement was her own, influenced by years of listening to everything from Oscar Peterson to Diana Krall, adapted for solo piano but retaining the swing and warmth of the original. This piece showcased a different side of her musical personality. Where the Chopin had been introspective and flowing, the jazz was conversational and engaging. Maya found herself smiling as she played, remembering why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about perfection or impressing anyone. It was about communication, about sharing something beautiful with other people. The response was even warmer this time. Several guests had stopped eating entirely to listen, and Maya could see phones discreetly appearing as people began recording short videos. The thought should have made her nervous, but instead it felt validating. These weren't pity recordings. These were people genuinely enjoying what she was sharing with them. Mr. Peterson appeared at the edge of her vision, giving her a thumbs up and mouthing, "Keep going." Mrs. Wellington was leaning forward in her chair, her earlier stress replaced by something that looked suspiciously like delight. Maya realized she'd passed whatever test the first 10 minutes had represented. For her third piece, Maya chose something more contemporary, a beautiful ballad that had been popular a few years earlier. She'd arranged it herself for solo piano, creating an instrumental version that maintained the song's emotional impact while showcasing the full range of the instrument. This was riskier territory, moving away from the safer classical and jazz standards, but Maya trusted her instincts. The song built slowly, starting with a simple melody in the right hand, while her left hand provided gentle harmonic support. As the piece developed, both hands began working together in more complex patterns, creating layers of sound that seemed to fill every corner of the restaurant. Maya felt like she was painting with music, adding colors and textures that created something entirely new from something familiar. By now, the entire dynamic of the evening had shifted. The piano wasn't background music anymore. It had become a focal point that enhanced everything else. Conversations had adjusted to complement the music rather than compete with it. The atmosphere felt more intimate somehow, as if Maya's performance had given everyone permission to slow down and actually experience the moment they were sharing. Maya segued into Bach's Prelude in C major, a piece that always reminded her of mathematical perfection made beautiful. Each note built on the previous one in patterns that felt both inevitable and surprising. Her fingers moved with precision and confidence, years of practice evident in the clean execution and thoughtful phrasing. The Prelude showcased her technical skills in a way that the previous pieces hadn't required. The intricate passages demanded precise fingerwork and careful attention to timing, but Maya navigated them smoothly, her years of late-night practice sessions finally paying off in the most unexpected venue. She finished with another jazz standard, Autumn Leaves, arranged in a style that incorporated elements of classical technique with jazz harmonies. It was a perfect ending piece, sophisticated enough for the setting but accessible enough to leave the audience wanting more. When the final notes faded into silence, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. People weren't just clapping politely anymore. They were genuinely appreciating what they'd experienced. Maya stood and took a small bow, feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized. Judge Harrison was the first to approach the piano, his face beaming with approval. "That was absolutely lovely," he said warmly. "I hope you'll be able to continue for the auction portion of the evening." Maya looked toward Mrs. Wellington, who was already nodding enthusiastically. "If you're willing," Mrs. Wellington said, "I think our guests would be delighted to hear more." As Maya sat back down at the piano, preparing for the next phase of the evening, she realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer Maya the waitress who happened to play piano. She was Maya the pianist, and for the first time in 3 years, that felt like the most natural thing in the world. The auction portion of the evening transformed Maya's role from background accompanist to something approaching featured entertainment. Mrs. Wellington, had briefed her quickly during the brief transition between courses, explaining that she needed music that would create energy and excitement without overwhelming the auctioneer's voice. Maya nodded, understanding instinctively what was needed, and began planning a set that would build momentum throughout the bidding process. As the lights dimmed slightly and the auction began, Maya started with upbeat jazz pieces that created a sophisticated party atmosphere. Her fingers danced across the keys with Take 5 by Dave Brubeck, the unusual time signature creating an engaging rhythm that seemed to encourage participation. She watched the room as she played, adjusting her dynamics to match the energy of the bidding, pulling back during crucial moments and building excitement during competitive rounds. The first few auction items were smaller pieces, artwork and weekend getaway packages that generated polite but modest bidding. Maya provided steady, supportive background music, but she could sense the room waiting for something bigger. When Mrs. Wellington announced the evening's major item, a week-long Mediterranean cruise donated by one of the city's premier travel agencies, Maya shifted into higher gear. She began playing Mac the Knife with a driving rhythm that seemed to pulse through the floorboards. The piece was bold and playful, encouraging the kind of competitive spirit that auction organizers dream of. As the bidding opened at $5,000, Maya could feel the energy in the room shift. Paddle numbers began rising with increasing frequency, and she matched the escalating excitement with more complex improvisation. The bidding climbed steadily through 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. Maya's music provided the perfect soundtrack, building tension during pauses and celebrating each new bid with flourishes that seemed to encourage even higher offers. When the final bid reached $32,000, nearly 3 times the cruise's retail value, the room erupted in applause that felt as much for Maya's contribution as for the winning bidder's generosity. But the real transformation happened during the final auction item of the evening. Mrs. Wellington announced a special addition to the program, something that hadn't been planned but felt appropriate, given the evening's unexpected musical success. The Children's Hospital Foundation would be auctioning the opportunity to commission a private concert from our remarkable discovery, Maya Chen. Maya felt her heart stop. She hadn't agreed to this, hadn't even been asked. But as she looked around the room, seeing the genuine enthusiasm and appreciation in the faces watching her, she realized this wasn't about her anymore. This was about something bigger, something that had started the moment she'd offered to help, and had grown into an evening that none of them would ever forget. The bidding for her private concert started at $1,000 and immediately jumped to $3,000. Maya continued playing, her fingers finding their way through The Girl from Ipanema, while her mind reeled with the implications of what was happening. These people weren't bidding on a desperate waitress trying to help out in an emergency. They were bidding on a musician they genuinely wanted to hear again. $5,000, $8,000, $12,000. The bidding became a friendly competition between Judge Harrison and Mrs. Chen, the woman who had provided Maya's dress. Back and forth they went, each raise accompanied by laughter and good-natured commentary from the crowd. Maya's music grew more elaborate and confident with each bid, her improvisations becoming bolder and more personal. When Judge Harrison's final bid of $18,000 was accepted, Maya finished her song and stood to acknowledge the applause. But Judge Harrison had more to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily the now silent room, "I want to share something with all of you. When I was young, I had the privilege of studying piano with a remarkable teacher who told me that true musical talent reveals itself not in perfect conditions, but in moments of courage. Tonight we've witnessed exactly that kind of courage." He gestured toward Maya, who felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. This young woman didn't just step in to save our evening. She reminded all of us why we fell in love with music in the first place. That's worth celebrating, and it's worth supporting. Judge Harrison paused, looking around the room with the natural authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "I'm not keeping this private concert for myself. Instead, I'm donating it back to the foundation to be scheduled as a benefit performance. And I'm also announcing a personal scholarship fund to support Maya's musical education, because talent like this deserves every opportunity to flourish." The applause that followed was unlike anything Maya had ever experienced. It wasn't polite appreciation or even enthusiastic approval. It was recognition, acknowledgement of something real and valuable that she had shared with them. People were standing now, and Maya could see tears in several eyes that reflected her own emotional overwhelm. Mrs. Wellington approached the piano, her professional composure cracking with genuine emotion. "Maya, I don't know how to thank you. You didn't just save our event. You made it unforgettable." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, business cards, and conversations Maya couldn't quite process. People who had seen her as invisible just hours earlier were now treating her like someone whose story mattered, whose future was worth investing in. Mr. Peterson, who had reluctantly agreed to let her try, was beaming with pride as if he'd discovered her personally. But the moment that would stay with Maya forever came near the end of the evening, when a woman in her 70s approached the piano with tears streaming down her face. Maya recognized her as Mrs. Rodriguez, one of the foundation board members, but they had never spoken directly. "My dear," Mrs. Rodriguez said softly, "I haven't cried at music like that since my daughter played for me before she passed away. She was a pianist too, you know. She would have loved what you did tonight." Maya felt something break open in her chest, a wall she'd built around her dreams 3 years earlier, when life had demanded practical choices over passionate ones. "Thank you," was all she managed to say. But Mrs. Rodriguez seemed to understand everything she couldn't put into words. As the evening wound down and guests began making their way to the valet stand, Maya found herself alone at the piano for a few final moments. She played softly, a simple melody her grandmother had hummed while cooking, something that had never had a name but had always meant home and love and the belief that beautiful things were worth preserving. Mr. Peterson approached as she finished, no longer the stressed manager from earlier, but someone who looked like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "Maya, we need to talk. About your future here, about what tonight means, about opportunities that might be opening up." Maya smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in years. "I'd like that. But right now I think I need to go home and call my grandmother's spirit to tell her what happened tonight. I think she would have been proud." 3 weeks later, Maya gave her 2 weeks' notice at the Ivory Room. Not because she was angry or ungrateful, but because the evening had opened doors she hadn't known existed. The scholarship Judge Harrison had established was real and substantial, enough to cover tuition at the conservatory she'd dreamed of attending. Several venues had reached out about regular performance opportunities, and she'd even been approached about recording some of the arrangements she'd improvised that memorable Friday night. But more than the practical opportunities, something internal had shifted. Maya had remembered who she was beneath the uniform and the exhaustion and the deferred dreams. She was a musician, had always been a musician. And that Friday evening at the Ivory Room had simply been the moment when everyone else finally got to see what her grandmother had known all along. The video recordings from that night, shared initially by impressed guests, had found their way to social media and beyond. Maya woke up one morning to find that Waitress Becomes Piano Star had accumulated over 2 million views across various platforms. The comments were overwhelmingly positive, filled with stories from other people who had dreams they'd put aside, talent they'd hidden, courage they were still looking for. Maya's story had become bigger than just one evening or one performance. It had become proof that it's never too late to step toward the person you were meant to be, that sometimes the most important stage is the one you never expected to find, and that the most beautiful music often comes from the courage to finally, fully let yourself be heard. On her last day at the Ivory Room, Maya played the piano one final time during the lunch shift. Just a few gentle pieces for the smaller afternoon crowd, but the manager had requested it, and several regular customers had specifically come in to hear her. As she finished with the same Chopin nocturne she'd started with that transformative Friday evening, Maya realized her story wasn't ending at the Ivory Room. It was just beginning.